Well, thank you for staying with us. We're back on the AM show, and this time we focus on the economy, not just of Ghana, but of many other African countries and the trajectory that we appear to be on. The Africa Center on Economic Transformation has put together a report spanning some 20 years between 2000 and 2020. We're going to delve into the elements in there, find out where we stand as a country, Ghana, and beyond, and their focal areas and what it means for the economic transformation of the continent. Joining us for that conversation, we have Dr. Ed Brown, or Edward K. Brown. We all call him Ed Brown, Senior Director, Research and Policy Engagements with the Africa Center for Economic Transformation. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
It's so good to have you join the conversation. Even before we get into your report and everything it brings to bear, I would ask you this straightforward question. When you look at African economies today, yes, on the back of COVID, on the back of the Russo-Ukrainian war and everything, what is the picture you see?
Well, I think it's very important to recognize the fact that the COVID, the Russian-Ukrainian wars have had some significant effects on the economy. But beyond that, if you look back 2 decades, you see that African economies have been struggling. So the narrative of Africa rising, which was, more or less being trumpeted in the early 2000s, was clearly a manifestation of growth. In other words, the economies are growing, but they were not creating jobs. And then when you have the financial crisis, as well as the COVID, and then the commodity super cycle that came in 2015, all these things had effect on the economies because the economies were not resilient enough to absorb these external shocks and recover quickly. So the picture that we continue to paint over the last 2 decades is that African economies are transforming slowly. They're transforming slowly. And in fact, what is even a little bit more disconcerting is that when you look at the year 2000 and you compare it to the early transformers, that gap between African economies and the early transformers, and I mentioned countries like North Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brazil, and so on, we see that gap over the last 20 years has even widened further. So even though the economies are transforming slowly, they are not catching up with the other economies. So that is the picture we have today, unfortunately. But that is not to say that there are no, successes. In fact, several countries have made good progress. And I can mention countries like Mauritius, Tunisia, Morocco, South Africa, that have really been transforming their economies over the last 2 decades, 2 to 3 decades. So the picture, while it sounds a little bit disconcerting, there are, areas of progress that we can learn from.
Right, and you highlight, of course, in the report some of these areas that we'll be getting into. But again, narrowing it down to Ghana, for example, because most of us are more concerned about where we are. On the back of our debt restructuring and everything else that we've seen, the initial haircut and now the second batch of it, looking at our external creditors and all of that. What is our peculiar situation in all of this?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a peculiar situation because the debt issue, it's a much more broader issue going beyond Ghana itself, in terms of what has happened since COVID, and the Ukrainian war. So the liquidity crisis was further precipitated by those shocks. Okay, and therefore for Ghana, what has been the main challenge is that you have an increasing proportion of the public debt being, the debt being domestic debts. Okay, so you have the external debts, but the domestic debts, and if you start restructuring the domestic debt, you're also creating a certain lack of confidence in the financial sector.
Right.
So there's always that challenge that you need to look at when you're looking at the debt situation in the country. But beyond the immediate liquidity crisis that we face is the issue of solvency. And the solvency is related to whether or not the economy is capable of financing its debt on a long-term, medium to long-term basis.
The health of the economy.
The health of the economy. That's what it is. Yeah.
Let's now come to the ATI itself, the African Transformation Index.
Yes.
You target 30 out of 54 countries, so not all African countries are in there. Why that? And maybe to kick start on that, what is the ATI all about?
Okay, the ATI is basically an indicator that traces the transformation trajectory of African economies over a period of time. So it does not only trace that, but it also compares it with other, early transformers. So that at least for each of these countries, you can begin to assess what it is. Now, it provides an analytical framework for, leaders, policymakers, but even you as a journalist, to be able to assess how the economies are performing. Even the ordinary man on the street, the civil society and others, can easily, because it's easily digestible, it's in a form that is intuitively, satisfying. And therefore you can use that to gauge what the economies are doing. And let me just make one simple description of what the ATI is. So we're saying that growth with depth. And the reason why we're saying growth with depth is that we've realized that growth alone, while necessary, is not sufficient. And we've seen jobless growth over the years. And therefore, you need to look at some of the levels of transformation. What are the key areas that you need to focus on in order to transform your economy? And here we're talking about depth. The depth is just an acronym for diversification. You need to diversify your economy.
Right.
In other words, you can't pack your eggs in one basket.
Which we've done for a long time.
Absolutely.
Natural resources and some
commodities,
few cash crops. And
gold, cocoa, woodworks and so on. In Ghana, what is called 70% of all our exports are in commodities. In 2000, in 2020, almost 90% of all our exports are still in those commodities. We haven't been able to diversify away from the primary production, and that is a key problem.
It makes for interesting reading, because if you look at manuscripts, blueprints, other documents from the Nkrumah era, there were plans. In fact, even before independence, if you look at the Gaggisberg, plans and all of that, there was supposed to be a major shift from even cocoa alone being a cash crop and all of that. But some 60 years on, we've still not been able to catch up on that idea.
Absolutely. I think the income substitution strategies of Nkrumah was meant to transform the economy. Unfortunately, the focus was on the public sector. So there was the public sector that was driving it. And with the public sector, the economic and commercial fundamentals are not clear. So it has to be driven by the private sector with the government supporting it. So I think that's part of the problem. And over the last 40 years, we've dismantled all those very important income substitution industries, and we haven't been able to replace them or support SMEs to grow to replace them. So we haven't been able to do that. And this is not only in Ghana; it's also in many other countries. And in fact, you cannot ascribe this to any of the regimes. It's a combination over several decades, beyond even the 20 years we're looking at. So the problem goes beyond that, but it also requires that the state must be entrepreneurial, must be strategic, must be constantly focusing on what are the key drivers of economic development in the country and how you can support the private sector in doing that. All the countries that have been able to transform, even the developed countries, the US and so on, the public sector was the foundation for many of the progresses. Even what Elon Musk is doing, and Google and also Microsoft, these were all developed by the Defense Research Agency of the federal government.
Right.
On the back of that, these companies were able to develop.
So providing the mechanisms for entrepreneurs to build economies, and then they create jobs and everything else falls in place. It's something that administration in and out has touted, but we've not been able to wrap our minds around technically. But is there any reason you targeted 30 out of 54 countries?
Yes, 30 are the ones with good data.
Okay.
Because we need to be able to assess over time good comparative data. So we're looking at credible sources of data. But this 30 are 89% of the GDP of Africa.
I see.
Okay, so I mean, and about 90% of the population. So these 30 countries are a good reflection of the countries we're talking about. But beyond that, we continue to, over time, we will continue to bring in more countries as data becomes available.
You assess these countries on 5 key components or dimensions, and the coverage, a score of 0 to 100, where you know 100, of course, would be considered highly transformed, and 0 meaning very poorly transformed. You look at metrics like diversification, and there's a meaning to that. Export competitiveness, productivity increases, technological upgrading, and human well-being. How did you encapsulate all of this in conducting this survey?
Yeah, the way, you know, I mean, the first report came out in 2014, and we spent 3 years looking at what have been the characteristics of economies that are transforming. So we looked at countries like Korea, Vietnam, you know, Singapore, Thailand, Brazil, you know, Chile, and so on, to see what are the key common characteristics that makes them a transformed economy. And what we found was that all these economies were able to diversify, first away from primary products, but into new export frontiers. So the level of sophistication of their production and exports increased. Then we also found that they were also very much export-oriented. But you see, today, you may not want to argue seriously about export orientation, but export orientation offers you the opportunity to peg your economies against the best in the world, because you are competing with them. The SMEs in Ghana should be able to compete with other SMEs in other countries that are equally competitive. So the export competitiveness is not just providing you with, exports per se, but also helping you to improve on the quality and the technological upgrading and sophistication of your economy. And it also, of course, provides the exchange. You know, I mean, the current account situation will be much more improved, and you can also then be able to import things that you don't produce. You know, so export is very important. But even more important is productivity. If we are clamoring for increasing wages, if productivity is not rising, when you increase wages, it's going to be inflationary. You know, so it's very important that you focus on productivity. And to do that, you need to begin to focus more on skills, education and skills, particularly in the TVET area, which is the rising or the growing green areas for the economies, which countries should be able to deal with. And then, of course, technology, as we all know, has been the driver of all the industrial revolutions, from the first, second to third, and now we have the fourth industrial revolution. So if you are not applying technology, and here the state has a role to play in supporting the small and medium-sized enterprises, in adapting new technologies to become competitive. But of course, the H is the human well-being. It's the composite. We go beyond just measuring poverty. We're measuring poverty through income, GDP, but also looking at inequality. We're also looking at the extent to which the society is integrating female into the labor force. So formal labor force employment of female constitutes a very important element, because without that, we cannot really increase human well-being. And we all know that female employment adds a lot to GDP.
True.
So if we don't do that, but this requires targeted, deliberate, intentional effort to do that.
And when you look at the report, I'll be going to the key highlights or the standout points from the report. I mean, I saw in part of it the movers and shakers when it comes to the African continent, the likes of Morocco and Tunisia and how they are faring, the likes of Gambia, the likes of Niger and Zimbabwe tapering off, things getting worse, Rwanda and all of that. But what would be the key highlights, the salient points to be deduced from this report?
Okay. I would say there are there are so many points, but I would just mention 3 salient points. And let me start with the good news. The good news is that...
give us the good before the bad.
Yes. The good news is that human well-being has been improving steadily over the years, over the last 20 years. And we see that today, people have a higher standard of living than they were in 2000. The data shows it. The measure that we're talking about, income inequality, per capita income, and then female employment, all together gives us the measure of human well-being. And we see that human well-being is improving over time. But it is vulnerable and fragile. Without the other dimensions of depth, we are not going to get anywhere. Because over time, if those dimensions continue to deteriorate, then human well-being also would become stagnant and later on begin to drop.
And you were talking earlier about COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukrainian war. They are clear examples. The least shocks put African economies, most African economies, in a swirl. Yeah. And we've seen it in Ghana.
Absolutely.
As well.
And it's all because we're not diversifying away from primary production. So when there are external shocks and commodity price bust, then it immediately has a ripple effect on the economy. Your earnings reduce significantly. Then you are not able to build the reserves you need to build fiscal resilience. The fiscal resilience means that you have enough buffer in terms of resources, foreign exchange, to be able to buy the kinds of products you don't produce. Now, if you don't have that, first of all, it's going to be inflationary because there'll be pressure on the cedi, and then exchange rates would depreciate. So that is very key.
Which are the countries making inroads?
Okay.
You've looked at a 20-year period.
Yes.
Which are the countries that have made the highest jumps, the most inroads in these economic, indices that you use, and which are the ones that are lagging behind? After which I would want us to specifically focus on Ghana.
Okay. Yeah, there are the countries that have been performing well over the years, like Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, South Africa. Then there are countries that have been doing well, that have done well, even though they started at a low level, like Rwanda, which is doing very well on the transformation indicators. So, and then Eswatini.
Right.
Eswatini is a small country, but it managed to capitalize.
That used to be, is it Swaziland?
Swaziland.
Right.
It capitalized on the AGOA to develop manufacturing extensively. And the problem we're facing in many African countries, as the structural transformation literature suggests, is that we are deindustrializing. Deindustrializing. In other words, manufacturing is shrinking. But in manufacturing is one of the sectors that can help to drive productivity. And we're not putting enough support, intentional support into manufacturing.
I like what you add, intentional.
Intentional. It has to be
not haphazard.
Yes. Intentional support to make manufacturing more sustainable, competitive, and investment ready. So if you look at so the countries, just back to your question, the countries that are not doing too well, countries like Niger, Gambia, and a few other countries in the Sahelian countries are not doing too well. And
now with everything happening in Niger, that makes everything,
absolutely,
the economy and management of some of these things, rather murky. On the standpoint of the fact that the rest of the world may not acknowledge their leadership in the first place, dealing with the rest of the world on the economic front. I know some support to Niger has been, taken away, which means that the situation could get worse. But on the other hand, they have uranium and everything that over the years have not really served them with all the governance, that the governments they have had.
Absolutely, because you see, part of the challenge, and it's an ongoing conversation in the international community, is the extent to which the CFA is either promoting or undermining, the economies of the Francophone countries, 14 of them, which are the countries that really are under the CFA program. Now, I think part of it requires some sort of international, recognition that there is a need to realign these economies to the other economies in the sub-region. That's one. The second thing you talked about, uranium, but also many of these, like for example, Niger has at least the largest herd of cattle and sheep and goats in the Sahel, in West Africa.
Some of them even end up here.
Yes. And, the whole derivative of leather and leather industries and so on could be developed. But you need to think regional and act local. You need to look at what are the regional opportunities that you need to bring together to ensure that these countries that are landlocked countries can begin to benefit from collaboration with the other countries and raise their income levels and transformation agenda.
I'm looking at the African average for technological upgrading, for example, and it's quite a concern looking at the 29.7 that I'm looking at. But you see the countries at the bottom of the index, Zimbabwe, Zambia, of course, they've had their own challenges. the Gambias and others. And then, like you mentioned, the Algerias, Botswana. Doing pretty well. Their economic transformation has been pretty interesting, what they've done there. There's also Cameroon in the picture. But when you come to Ghana, what picture is painted? What lessons can we learn from the ATI?
Okay. I think Ghana, there are 3 areas where there needs to be intentional support. In the whole area of diversification, we need to begin to look at how we can diversify away from the primary products. And analysis have been made about the non-traditional exports. But government needs to provide intentional guidance and support to make this happen, to steer the private sector into those areas through some kind of fiscal framework that will allow the companies who are moving into these areas, even also in terms of climate, the kinds of industries that can emerge in climate. You're talking about textile and recycling of garments and so on. You're talking about waste, electronic waste, and plastics. These are all sectors that would require a lot of support going forward because the technologies are now growing. The government should play an active role in understanding what are the emerging technologies and how they can help support companies to be able to access this financing to do this kind of work. It's very, very, very important in that area. So that's the second element is productivity. In Ghana, the productivity levels is declining. And productivity is driven by 2 main factors. That is skills, education, of course, and technology. And we see that the level of technical and vocational education is very low, and the quality is poor. Of course, the government is doing a lot in that area. It takes time, but there has to be much more aggressive effort to crowd in the youth into those sectors and to support them, to have the skills required for the changing nature of jobs, the digitalization, innovations, and so on that are emerging. We need people who are capable of creating even new technologies which are more labor intensive. Right. Because the technologies that we observe, the Western technologies, are very much labor substitution. Okay. And are there any opportunities to create new technologies that could be labor intensive? Given the rapidly growing population in Africa, yes, about 45% of the world's the youth population in the world by 2050 would be in Africa. But what is the quality of the education? To what extent can we begin?
How ready are they for the labor market?
Absolutely.
Those are the questions.
That's the question.
But my final bit to you, with this ATI, this African Transformation Index, how can it shape policy, our national planning on the continent, maybe specifically in Ghana, and a more resilient economy overall? Let's focus on Ghana for that.
Yes, for Ghana. Actually, what we're doing, beyond having this composite for the whole of Africa, the 30 countries, we are doing what we call country economic transformation outlooks, which is bringing together key stakeholders, including government, to really look at what are the areas that you need to focus on to diversify your economy. So we've done what we call the product space analysis, which looks at the various types of commodities or products that Ghana, given its endowment, can easily become more competitive, even though it has a comparative advantage.
Right.
But it becomes more competitive. So it's extremely important that we begin to look at the development agenda from that transformation lens. So what we're trying to do is to bring stakeholders together to appreciate the importance of using these dimensions, these indicators. Once we focus on those indicators, the point about the indicators is that they are not just policy, they are actual on the ground. If your economy is diversifying, you know it's diversifying, right, because the data shows that it's diversifying, and we have a way to calculate that. If your economy is export competitive, we know. So you can more or less feel transformation because the data is there. It's not, oh, we've built 10,000 kilometers of road or we built X number of schools and so on. No, those are inputs. Okay, but the real outcome, the results,
right,
these 5 dimensions are critical if you focus on them. In other words, if the president says to his lieutenant and say, listen, I don't want any other thing, I want my economy to be diversified. So you, Minister of Industry and Trade, Minister of Finance, Minister of Agri, come together. What do you do? How do we get it done? Export competitiveness, the Export Promotion Agency and all that. Bring them together, right, and give them targets about what they need to do. If you focus on that, you would be able, then you wouldn't be, in fact, the issues of malfeasance, corruption, and so on would be reduced because you're not looking at the number of ambulances you're buying. You're looking at the number of, the maternal mortality that is reducing.
Right.
And all those things that relate to
And that's the good thing about data. They say the devil is in the detail, and I would say the devil of our economic maltransformation is in the data that we do not apply. But we're grateful, Doc, that you've taken the time to join us this morning. And moving forward, we would like to see how all of this shapes policy and our national economic life in terms of development. Joining us for this conversation, Dr. Edward K. Brown. He is Senior Director of Research and Policy Engagements with the African Center for Economic Transformation. He joined us for a conversation this morning. Do stay with us. There's a lot more coming your way on the AM show after the break.